Question for you. What should life look like after we come to faith in Jesus? Like, what changes? What's different? Different people come to different conclusions on the topic. We won't talk about all of them, but for some, and this is one I've seen show up in the life of the church with some regularity over the last 20 years or so. It's gone longer than that, but that's kind of my experience. For some, salvation is kind of a one-and-done deal. Does that make sense? You walk the aisle, you kneel at the altar, you go to the revival, you say the prayer, maybe you sign the card, you fill out the survey, you're on the team, you're done. You're good. Nothing else to do. You prayed the prayer, you believed in Jesus, you got saved. Gravy. This kind of approach to salvation puts little emphasis on life after conversion. Conversion is the moment we offer ourselves to Jesus the first time, we trust Him the first time. Little energy or no focus whatsoever on the character of the Christian life. So what does life look like after we come to faith in Jesus? And friends, I've been in ministry situations, sometimes deeply grievous ministry situations, where people have been on their deathbed, or have walked into hospital rooms, family members of people to whom I was a pastor, but maybe I wasn't a pastor to the person who was dying. And in those situations, I'll just say, does this person have a church, a pastor? And that helps me know, am I the pastor here? Or is there somebody else who I can support? Is somebody else coming along? And there have been times, one in particular stands out in my memory, where the family said of this person who would die soon, oh no, she hasn't been to church in 20-something years. But she got saved. When I hear that sort of sentiment in that sort of setting, it breaks my heart. Because it means we, the church, have offered people a false sense of security. A false sense of what God's grace accomplishes and how it works. This family told me a story of a teenage girl who went down front at some sort of event, gave her life to Jesus, went off, and nothing changed. Not trying to make a comment on the sincerity of that young girl at that moment. Simply that somehow, some way, the church said, you're good. And never asked, is there evidence of God's grace bearing fruit in your life? And when we do that, let's call it ministry malpractice. When we do that, we offer people a truncated gospel, if it's any gospel at all. A deeply unbiblical vision of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And a false sense of security. So what does life after conversion look like? What should our own lives be oriented towards? What sort of things ought we to be engaged in? What should we be cultivating? And what should we be teaching our children? Like, when they show up to the youth revival or when somebody shows up to a special event and they do feel something and they do profess faith in Jesus, do we just sort of let them go back to life as usual? Or do we help them down a path of discipleship to connect with other believers and become part of the mission and serve alongside other Christians so that thing that has taken root in their life can grow and develop so that they can bear fruit, so they can be transformed? What does that look like? And what should be the guiding principle? And when we come to Galatians chapter 5, we get a vision of the character of the Christian life, don't we? I mean, here's Paul saying, Your life could look like this, but it should look like that. And they're very different, deeply opposed. We'll get into that in a moment. If we're going to sum it up, though, maybe we can hold on to this. Right? If we're talking about belonging to Jesus, if we're talking about life after Christ takes hold of us, if we're talking about subsequent to conversion, like after I came down front and prayed the prayer, or after I was in my room by myself and I felt the Spirit of God move in my heart and I wept in conversion, like what happens after that? After Jesus takes hold of me and I belong to Him, for Paul, for us, for the Galatians, for this church, belonging to Christ means we crucify the flesh and cultivate the Spirit. And we're going to talk more about that. But for now, there's two pieces there. Number one, crucify the flesh. Number two, cultivate the Spirit. Bottom line, right there. Belonging to Christ means we crucify the flesh in order to cultivate the Spirit. Now, the whole thing here turns on one big contrast, doesn't it? In fact, verse 22, Paul says, by contrast. And contrast means we got two things. We're going to set them side by side, and they're different. Like we want to highlight the differences between these two things. This one's not that one's not this one. They're distinct. And the two terms he uses, and we're going to dig into this, try to get clear on what he means by this. One is flesh, and the other is spirit. And he says these two things in verse 17 are opposed to each other. Just listen to these verses again. Galatians 5:16, live by the Spirit, I say, do not gratify the desires of the flesh. Right? So if your life is ordered by the Spirit of God, then you're not living in this life of flesh gratification. Again, we're going to talk about what flesh means in a minute. Right now, we're trying to understand the stark contrast. Right? So if we're given to the Spirit, it means we're not gratifying the flesh. Verse 17, for what the flesh desires is opposed to the Spirit. So it's not even like one or the other, and either option's fine. It's these two are in opposition to one another. They are embattled. They are set opposed, flesh and spirit. What the flesh desires is opposed to the Spirit. What the Spirit desires is opposed to the flesh. Listen to the language of desire. Like this is God's Spirit, an agent who is at work powerfully in the lives of the people of God to do something. But whatever He's doing is opposed to this other thing called flesh. So for starters, let's just understand, for Paul, spirit, flesh, mutually exclusive. Like you don't get both. It's not have your cake and eat it too. It's one or the other. In every moment of our lives, every decision we make, when we do things, all things, we are choosing to either live according to the Spirit of God or gratify the flesh. In that moment when somebody did something at work and I'd really like to give them a piece of my mind. No one's ever been there. Am I going to live by the Spirit or will I gratify the flesh? When my children fill in the blank, will I live by the Spirit, gratify the flesh? So there's this deep contrast, mutual exclusivity between the Spirit and the flesh. But what are these? We have a good idea what Paul means when he talks about the Spirit of God, God's presence at work in us. We'll talk more about that. But what's this flesh language all about? And it's easy to get confused, right? Because sometimes when Paul uses the word flesh, he just means my body, like this stuff, pinchable, touchable, like you shake hands with your hand and it's covered with flesh. And that's kind of a neutral term for Paul, and it just means your body. Other times, he uses the word flesh in a morally negative sense. That's where we are in Galatians chapter 5. So it's not my physical body, it's something else. It's not just my hands and my feet and my eyes, my flesh, my skin. It's not that. He's not talking about my physicality in Galatians 5. He's talking about something else. What's he talking about? For Paul, the negative uses of the flesh, when flesh is opposed to spirit, God's spirit, he is talking about human life in corruption, human life in opposition to God, human life that's contrary to the life God designed for us and intended for us, human life given to sin, human life turned in on itself. I'm going to have my way no matter what. And when we read through the works of the flesh in a moment, that kind of image, I'm going to have my way no matter what, is on everyone. For Paul, the flesh is human life, the negative uses of the flesh, not the kind of neutral, just talking about my physicality. Because for Paul, the physical body is a good thing that one day God's going to raise from the dead. We said that in the creeds. We recognize that. But this negative use of the term flesh is human life in principled opposition to God. So if there's something in my life that is opposed to God and His purposes for me and the world, we're going to call that the flesh. Now there's two further aspects of this. These come out in different places in Paul's writings. Number one, our flesh, that's a way of talking about our captivity. Like we're captive to sin. So we come into the world as infants, and we're cute most of the time, and sweet, and people want to like pinch our cheeks, but we're sinners. We sin, like our nature is corrupted, and we're captive to that, and we just do it. And as we get older, we can feel the compulsion. We can feel like, I know I shouldn't do that, but I'm compelled to, and I'm going to say it, or I'm going to do it, I'm going to behave in this way. We're captives. We know the right thing, and we don't do it. That resonates with us. A sense of captivity. We're slaves. And that's why we need Jesus to set us free. That's why we need the Spirit to come and set us free from that captivity. So when Paul talks about the flesh, he's talking about human life in opposition to God with an aspect of captivity. Like I'm a slave to something apart from Jesus. But it's not just captivity. It's not just the fact that some power has got hold of me and I'm just sort of an innocent bystander and can't do anything about it. There's also an aspect of complicity. We are complicit with the flesh. We give ourselves to it. We want to do it. We know what we ought to do. We don't do it. We feel compelled and we want to do it. So this language of flesh for Paul involves captivity, like I'm a slave to this, and complicity. I'm giving myself to this.